This conference will now be recorded.
So we're going to pick up a little bit where we left off last week, but I do have a few more things that I was able to add. And so we're talking about planting into heavy covers. And one of the things that I believe I might have mentioned is these angle pitch closing brackets that Yetter has just released. And I'm just going to show you now. We're going to talk about it later. We were able to plant that. We were able to use them on several acres. But I'm going to talk about that at the end today. So these are just been released for testing. They're not for sale yet, as I understand. They're going to go through the season. But we were testing. They gave me 2 rows to try. So we'll swing back around to that at the end. But just quickly review from last week. We talked about planting into heavy covers. What does heavy covers mean? Well, I'm saying whatever you define heavy cover, I guess, is where we're going to define it. But this is just going into a very nice thick stand of hairy vetch, or maybe heavy cover can be described as when you can hardly see the tractor or the planter at least. And sometimes it's not all standing. Sometimes it blows down. And we talked about that last week. One of the examples I gave was from last year. A neighboring friend of mine had this triticale on a wet farm, on a couple wet fields, and it was just an example there of how you can, to plant into a heavy cover like this requires special equipment. So you're going to have to have the right equipment. He had a no-till planter, but my planter is a little bit, has airbags and a little more set up with some aggressive row cleaners, the shark tooth row cleaners that I have. So we were able to plant into very, very heavy residue. This actually was 15-inch corn intended for silage, and it it did turn out pretty well. But in order to cut through those tough stems, I mean, you can literally see in this case the triticale has already started to turn, and I think he got a pretty nice, good cover crop there because those seeds were basically all viable by the fall. The only problem was this is a kind of a wet field to begin with, and those of you who know how our area was, we were really wet, and they kind of mudded that up, some parts of it in the fall. So he had to go in there and fix a few things up, but it would have been a lot worse, he said, if they wouldn't have had heavy cover crops. So one of the keys is having good equipment, and this is just my residue cleaners that I happen to have on my planter, and so the Yetter shark tooth, the Martin razor something they call it, some type of a closing wheel that sweeps back so you don't get wrapping, because that's a big problem when we're into heavy covers. What is a little difficult to see here, I guess you really can't see it, is there's actually deflectors in the inside there to actually deflect out pieces of residue so it doesn't begin the wrapping. The other factor too is that what is called the treader wheel, the aluminum 2-inch wide little wheel there that's bolted on there, that is designed so that the residue managers don't gouge in too deep into the soil. But it also helps to flatten out the cover crop a little bit as it's gone through, and that's also another way to help get through really tough conditions. So one of the big things one of the really important reasons why we need to try to get some of the residue out of the way or get it cut cleanly is so we don't have hairpinning. And if your seed is placed next to cover crop residue or any type of residue that's not cleanly cut, you plant, if it gets dry, air gets in there, it dries out, the seed may not grow, or it may be late or may be delayed. Wetter conditions sometimes can overcome this, but getting that proper seed to soil contact is crucial. This is what we want. And sometimes a way to do that is to plant a little deeper. The thing about it is typically when we're getting later, when our cover crops are heavier, When we're getting later in the year, the soil temperature is beginning to warm up, so planting a little deeper is actually a good idea, so that we can do that and get a cleaner cut. Because when the colders cut deeper, or your double disc openers cut deeper, you'll get a cleaner cut. So that brings us kind of up to date from last week, and this is what we're going to start out with here today to talk a little bit about weed control and fertility with heavy cover crops. This is a field of mine a couple years ago that obviously you see the crimson clover there. There's some hairy vetch in there. If you look hard enough, you might see some peas. I know that not there weren't many in here, but so there you got a heavy nitrogen producer. We're going in at a little bit even past the peak nitrogen contribution of the crimson clover. Hairy vetch is like everything is there. In this particular field, I added 80 pounds of N, as you see there in the top, to grow this corn. We got 27 tons of silage. And yes, that does include along the woods where the deer had come out and eaten it a little bit. So I wouldn't doubt my whole field average was a little bit higher than that. Well, I know it was. I'm not sure how much, but that's what we took off the field. So that's what I wrote down here. The other key thing here you want to see is $5 worth of herbicide. That was pretty much that herbicide right there was just a little bit of burn down. In this case, I used gramoxone. Glyphosate does not work very well on hairy vetch or crimson clover for that matter. So when it's this mature, 2 pints of gramoxone after going through like that. By the way, 15-inch rows here again. This was made for silage. So with a 15-inch splitter planter like you see, we're running it down. You can see how much it's down. I didn't bother. I don't have rollers on my planter. I did not bother, rolling that in that situation. Could you rolled that and done with no herbicide? My experience has been a little herbicide goes a long way. So that's what I did right there. That hairy vetch, you can't hardly see any blue flowers in it. That undoubtedly would have regrew a little bit without any herbicide. So, how do you calculate nutrient credits when you have a heavy cover crop, when there's a lot of legumes? It's one thing that's important to consider and a potential benefit. It's difficult to have an exact recipe to know. I just have done enough testing on my farm that a lot of times 60 pounds, 75 pounds of nitrogen to grow 200 bushel corn is about all you need. You could argue you might need any, and you could grow a decent crop probably with any, but I've seen a little bit really helps just kind of push it up over the edge for your potential anyway. If we do have a situation where there's actually more grass in the mix, that you don't have that nitrogen credit. This picture here, I'm going to talk about some weed control, but this is actually that same field, I believe, a year later, where in this case we had cereal rye, and you can see there's a little bit of vetch in there. So just looking at that right there, and let's just run through a quick scenario. If it would be straight, we'll call it cereal rye, triticale, wheat, grass crop, you're going to pretty much have to give full nitrogen for your corn unless you've been in a system of no-till and cover crops for a decade or more. Then you can start giving credits there for organic matter and just better soil and everything like that. But still, with what you see there, I don't remember what I put on this field, but I'm just looking at what that looks like. I would estimate around 120 pounds of nitrogen, probably to grow a good silage corn crop there. So that's just a little bit of an example there. So I'm just going to pause for a second here to see, is there any questions so far that would have to do with fertility? And I do have a few more weed control pictures, but let's kind of stick to fertility and heavy covers. Any questions anybody has in that regard? Anybody? Go ahead, Stephanie.
So you said you did a lot of testing on your own farm just to kind of see what you found there. Can you kind of
Yeah.
describe what you did to get to that point, and how long does it take? I would guess that you would want to, if you're clipping and doing a biomass calculation, you'd want to do it uh, right away or right at that time that you're planting.
Yeah. Yeah, you would do it right at the time of planting. Uh, and that is an option. But Stephanie, I kind of like to think like a farmer and doing my research. So this goes back to my cover crop seed days when I was selling cover crop seeds. Did a lot of research here in my farm, and I've done hundreds, if not thousands, of small plots where what we would do in a situation like this, we would put 0, 50, 100, 150, 200. That was my 5 treatments. Always have a 0 because you got to know where you're at. You got to know what you're working with. What is the baseline? And then for me, 200 being my average production on farm. I mean, when you add everything together, I'm about 185. That's the year in year out average. So I'm not the best farm in the world in that regard, but so 200 for me is always plenty. So, but you always want to know. So I use those 5 rates, Stephanie, and that's how I've pretty much uh, come to the conclusion now on my fields. I can see that when I have a good stand of a legume, I've been as low as 40 pound, 50 pound, 60 pound, uh, and sometimes a little more. It depends. That's all I need additional nitrogen to do what I would say is an economic, um, you know, uh, economic viable, whatever. I will tell you that I am evolving a little bit in trying to use even less nitrogen because of it seems like there's more and more anecdotal evidence, at least, that when you start weaning yourself off nitrogen, the microbes come alive and they start helping you out a lot more. I think there's something to that. And so, I don't know if anybody else has any opinions on that or not, but so to answer your question, I have done replicated research. And I'll just say I did those 5 different rates, but we always replicated it. Sometimes it's field length, and sometimes it's smaller plots, depending on the scope of the trial. So that's how I come up with that. And people ask me, well, how much nitrogen can I reduce if I use cover crops? Well, I don't know. There's so many other questions, so many other variabilities, and it really does come down to each farm. And now with variable rate technology, you can pretty much adjust that from the tractor sometimes. Your rates of nitrogen, and if you keep track of it, and tie it in with yield monitor. If you have field length rows and can match them to, your combine width and your planter width and all that, it's with some forethought, you can actually do testing on your own farm, which is going to be your best information. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Hey,
Lloyd.
Steve. Yeah, would the Haney
Yeah.
test give you a rough guess of how much nitrogen you would need?
The Haney test, I think I'll answer it the way you ask it. It will give you a rough estimate. I have done hundreds of Haney tests on my farm. That being said, it was in 2013 and 2014, so that was when it was just coming out. I will say that, as I understand, it has been improved now, but I didn't feel like I could rely on that quite as much as I had hoped at that time. And I'll just say that I think it has gotten better and a little bit more predictable, a little bit more consistent. But so to answer your question, Lloyd, yes, I've used the Haney test. I kind of feel like I almost found out I almost know what by looking at the cover crop. I mean, again, you have to understand, I have 25 years experience. I'm not bragging. I'm not being arrogant. I'm just saying you start to see things, you observe things, and I got to admit, you do so many research and you get tired of it. So that's just the reality out there. And so you just kind of zone in. Not that I'm not continuing to evolve, but that's my answer to your question there, Lloyd.
Yeah, I guess for the newcomer and saying, well, how much
Yeah,
nitrogen, how much organic nitrogen, and all that,
yeah.
I thought the Haney test might be a good starting point.
Oh, it is, and I would encourage people to try it to see where you're at. I wouldn't fine tune 1,000-acre farm the first year on using the Haney test, if I can say that. I think you have to get used to it and get your own confidence level in your own farm. Maybe that's another way of what I'm trying to imply here. I think, David, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, so 2 weeks ago I was out and did some biomass sampling
Yep.
on some cover crops. It was cereal rye, balansa clover, and crimson
Mhm,
clover. At the same
mhm,
time, I pulled soil cores to look at doing the Haney test, and I paired
mhm,
that with a PLFA test as well, just to see what
uh-huh,
microbial activity I had going on in that soil.
mhm,
Um, my biomass was, it was about 4,300 um,
mhm,
pounds per acre dry matter. I came
mhm,
back with like 90 pounds of nitrogen, 117 pounds of potassium, 37
mhm,
pounds of phosphorus. Um,
mhm.
my carbon to nitrogen at that stage was like a 22 to 1.
Perfect.
But yeah, and I'm sure by now it's probably closer to that
Yeah,
30 to 1 since my rye is a lot more
yeah,
mature and everything.
sure. Yep.
But the Haney test actually came back and only showed us having like 14 pounds of nitrogen in that soil profile.
Mhm,
But you got to
mhm.
remember that growing cover crop is using quite a bit as well.
Well, it's up in the biomass. Yes. Hmm.
But then when you looked at it like, so this is, this village has been in cover crop, I think 3 years. And
Okay.
of those 3 years, we haven't had the best stands. So our soil
Hmm.
structure really isn't that great. We don't have
Okay.
the aggregate structure we want. When we started looking at like
Yeah.
the protozoa, there was no
Okay.
protozoa that was showing up in our PLFA test. So there was
Okay.
nothing that was
I
consuming the
see.
bacteria and releasing that nitrogen. So it all kind of
Hmm.
rolls into what's your soil like as well.
Right.
So
Well, yeah. And that's again my reference to you do have to try on your own fields. All these tests are I think they're great, and I think they will get better. But biology is a very very kind of elusive sometimes uh, thing to wrap your arms around. It's just not an exact science when we're talking about biology here and microbes and all that. But we're getting some tools that are indeed showing some promise. And so good. Okay, any other questions before we move on and focus a little bit more on weed control?
Hey Steve, I like your
Yeah.
picture of your tractor with all the
Ah,
all the pollen all over
yeah.
all over the equipment.
Yeah, you can hardly see it's a John Deere anymore. Well, I thought about putting that in here, but while you brought it up, Stephanie, it is an issue sometimes. And I'll just make mention that if you were trying to roll a cover crop without using any herbicides, we're getting really close here with what you see there in that picture. Yes, it is definitely pollinating. I remember that day, and I got to tell you one thing: it can clog up your radiator, your tractor. So that's one thing to be aware of. Watch your temperature gauge for sure. And but I will tell you, I remember going to that field. I went out there first light in the morning because there was some dew, and the dew will help lower the pollen. Going out, getting airborne, getting in your radiator. The other thing is too is if you happen to have, and it doesn't happen all the time, but if you have a light rain or something moving in or something, you can wait till then. And it's amazing, depending how your conditions are, but it's all about managing the pollen. If you do have a little rain coming, you can roll a long time before you need to stop to get out of the field. And I've done that. I've done it at night. Those of you who listen to a lot of my other webinars have probably seen me doing that. The pollen is a concern with your tractor, and sometimes you just have to almost every half hour or so take out clean the radiator out. Now, a lot of the newer tractors, and mine's a 6125R series John Deere there's a screen in front of the radiator that does block a lot of it out. And you can just pull that screen right out, shake it off by hand. It's like a 5-minute job. Yes, it is a pain, but it's just what you have to do in this. If you can't work around any other way, if you have to roll. So that's just, I'm glad you brought that up. But it certainly is, it is a factor that you have to work around. Any other questions before we move on? So when we talk about weed control, usually in the context of cover crops and heavy covers, we're talking about the heavy cover, the actual suppression, the shading out of weeds. And just using this as an example, this picture here, and I'm going to advance to the next slide. And before it comes up, I'll just say that this is how it looks when you roll a cover crop like this, a little different part of the field. But here we're coming back in again with 15-inch silage corn, and a roller at this point, like I alluded to earlier, will do a pretty good job. Now this was just rolled probably the same day as we're planting there, but you know, you got to have this kind of a cover. David was mentioning here a second ago about 4,000 pounds per acre. The numbers I've seen, if you want to translate it to biomass, that 3,000 to 4,000 pounds per acre is kind of necessary if you're going to expect to get decent weed control. So that's just an FYI, so to speak, to understand what it does take on average conditions. I'll just forward here to the next picture and show you that this is that exact field a couple weeks later. So not only did I not need residual on most of the field, I'll tell you what I did do, because this had a lot of cereal rye in it, knowing that we're going to need some nitrogen. I put on 20 gallon per acre of 28% with, as I recall, 2 pint of gramoxone to finish that off, and man, that fried it. Probably could have even used a little less. But this is a case here where I knew I had good enough cover that did not apply any residual. If you see my little notation in the bottom of the slide there, 0 residual, but I did post-emergence on some of the field. The bottom part of that field had a little burr cucumber, and you can't let burr cucumber get out of control. So I had a spray of 40-foot width on the bottom of that field there. So full disclosure, but that's pretty nice looking corn there with no residual. Now, because that was rye this time, I recall I put 160 pounds of nitrogen on that. And so that's just kind of the opposite effect of when you go with legumes. So any questions on heavy cover crops and corn? Planting corn into a heavy cover crop, because we're going to switch to soybeans here in a second. Any questions on that? Anybody? Okay. So soybeans, as we all know, soybeans are much more forgiving and much easier to establish in a heavy cover, because one of the big challenges of heavy cover is not having all the good seed to soil contact and not maybe as good of a stand. You have to have a good planter, you got to know what you're doing. But soybeans, if you have a few skips here and there, not a big deal. But we've said many times here that how easy it is to plant soybeans into heavy cover, particularly cereal rye. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I only have this one slide, and I want to talk about the closing wheels here to wrap things up today. But any comments on planting the heavy covers into cereal rye? Comments or questions on that? So I know Jack there in Iowa, you've been working with that. I remember last year you told some stories. What are you thinking this year, Jack, as far as what's it looking like in your neighborhood? Is there people doing a lot of beans in the cereal rye?
There's not a lot, but it's kind of growing. They've been observing what I've been doing and the weed control that I've been able to get with it, and it's worked out. There's getting to be more and more of them that's planting green.
Right. Anyone else have any comments on planting green, planting in the heavy covers in the cereal rye, beans, or whatever? Okay, let's wrap it up here. And this really applies, I think, because there's one of the things that I have been really, really looking forward to is having these adjustable pitch or toe-in adjustments on closing wheels. And what's kind of ironic, if you can say it, is I first saw this in France about 3 or 4 years ago, and I've seen over there actually now numerous pieces of equipment that have this adjustment where you can tow the wheels in and out. And actually, I have right here, right beside me in my office today, a guy from France who's visiting the farm. So it's kind of cool that he's here looking over my shoulder as I share this webinar, because to my knowledge, this is one of the first adjustable toe-in closing wheels that has been released. This is from Yetter. They debuted it at the National Farm Machinery Show in Kentucky back there in February. They have placed about 100 rows out around the country to test, and they sent me a couple. So the nice thing about this is that you're able to adjust the toe in of these closing wheels so that they can literally pull the seed slot shut. And my internet speed is just too slow to upload a decent video site. I'm not going to show you a video here, but there's an adjustment that they have to do that. It's as easy as can be. There's a little lever in the bottom. That's where I'm pointing to with that arrow there. And if you look at it a little bit closer, you can see the adjustability. It's just very simple. You just pull it out and adjust it wherever you want to, and that adjusts it in and out. And the thing of it is these closing wheels, the brackets, the pitch, the angle, whatever you want to call it, is still 1970s technology. That's back, that was pretty much set when the John Deere Max-Emerge planter came out. And that was designed to pack soil around the seed. That's the way that angle is. If you look at the angles, that's what it's designed to do. Where in a no-till situation, or particularly even a heavy cover crop situation, where you have this tremendous root mass, when you try to pack it, it takes a lot of pressure or a lot of force, a lot of spring tension or whatever you have back there to actually get it shut. You're actually almost fighting it. You don't have to do that if we just engineer it right. So I'm just going to fast forward here to another picture of it so you can see the bottom of it to see how it looks. And I want to point out the spring there. Obviously, it happens to be a John Deere spring. I'm sure that when they get released, they're going to be all black. But that's what they sent. But what is interesting is that spring now is a more milder version, or should I say, a weaker version of the spring. The reason is we don't need the type of tension that we've needed before. You just don't need it. And I'm just going to back up here a slide. Because you don't need it, then you don't really have enough options with the normal heavy duty spring. And as a matter of fact, you hardly need any pressure on it sometimes, which is amazing when this angle is right for your conditions. So they give you a smaller or weaker spring in order to make your adjustments more in the range of what you need to do. So I just think this is good. I do know there's several other manufacturers looking at this. And I do know that John Deere actually has it in their Brazilian planters in Brazil, the ones they make there. Why they don't have them here is beyond me. I just think there'd be a big market for this, especially with planting green now, especially with the roots that are sometimes, they make it harder to close. So that's pretty cool to be able to see this starting to come to fruition. And I'm thinking with our 6-row planter, we planted about 40 or 50 acres, and yeah, it's doing exactly what I had hoped to do and what I expected. So, any questions on this angle pitch closing bracket? Any questions anybody has? Okay, I'm just gonna just share what we'll be talking about next week. And we were talking before we went live here about how lots of areas are still wet, and I thought this would be an appropriate picture, unfortunately. So next week we're going to be talking about prevented planning, question mark, seizing the opportunity, exclamation mark. So I feel like it's unfortunate. Of course, you can't get, some are not going to be able to get their cash crops planted. And it looks like this might be in larger sections than we really like, but it is what it is. Nonetheless, we're going to talk about what are the best species, timing, because some of these, we don't know when they're going to dry out. Some of these areas, how do you work around a wet area of a field? What do you do about that, and so forth? So that's what I'm going to be talking about next week. But just to wrap up today, is there anybody else has any cover crop question at all? Any question at all you have? It could be about today's topic or some other cover crop topic that you've been thinking about.
Steve, it's Jack.
Yeah, go ahead.
As you were showing that variable
Yeah.
pitch closing wheel there, in the closing wheel that you had on there, having it pull it down like that, does that make it more susceptible to wrapping?
Great question, Jack. And just because I know a lot of you are curious, that's Pro Stitch closing wheels. I want to be clear, they are not Yetter. The closing wheels are not Yetter. They're Pro Stitch. I like them. That's what's on my planner now. I do have some Yetter, I guess they call it twisted spikes or whatever they are, or twisted something they call them. Yetter does. So the answer to your question is it may well. And what I don't have on there is, on that picture, is a deflector. Yetter has a really good deflector for that. I would say that if you are getting into a situation that you're getting into heavy covers and you have an aggressive spiked type closing wheel, some are more aggressive than others, you may have to get a deflector to eliminate that. Those deflectors are great, but they really require some fine tuning to work. So at least you know they're out there now. So that's just an FYI on that. So other questions? Go ahead. A couple people are lighting up here. Todd, Stephanie?
What I was going to ask,
Yeah.
what you've talked about, is it exactly the same for pumpkins as for beans or corn or?
Yeah. What I'm probably going to do, are you referring to the angle pitch closing wheel?
I'm talking about planting in the heavy covers.
Oh, heavy covers. Okay, the overall thing. Yeah, it's pretty much it's all applicable. And a lot of times that's what when we're planting squash and pumpkins, we're planting into heavy covers. That's what we want. We want to grow them heavy. We want to grow them big. And to get weed control and also to keep our pumpkins and squash cleaner. So that certainly is the goal. And I showed last week. If you didn't see last week's, you might want to go back and look at it, because I showed the residue slicer that is designed to cut through heavy residue. So go back and watch last week's webinar if you want to see more information on that, Todd. If you weren't on last week, I forget if you were on or not.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else?
All our businesses around here can,
Bob?
Hey, Steve. Hey,
Yeah.
I have crimson clover and it's just starting to go into bloom. You have to look real hard for it. What stage should I roll crimp that to terminate it?
So do you want to terminate it with the roller?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's really pretty. When you're out there trying to take pictures of it, Bob, And you
Then,
can't help it. You just got to take one more picture of it. That's when you want to roll.
okay, so when it's in full bloom or just past or something.
Well, you know how crimson clover does it. The blooms kind of start at the bottom and work up, and it's always a fine line, which is the best day to take a picture, and everything. And I you might have heard me say this before, but I had a beautiful stand of crimson clover. Actually, it was that field I started with today almost, and we went through and no, it wasn't that field. It was another because we rolled it, and my neighbor texted me and said, "What do you do with that beautiful field?" Which I thought was kind of cool that they noticed it, and I said, I just rolled her down, man. Time to plant. So anyway,
all
yes,
right.
I'd say full bloom. Yep. Okay. Any other questions? Other questions from anybody? Okay. One more time. Any more questions for today's topic, or any cover crop topic? Okay, well, thanks for everyone who joined us. I really appreciate it. Appreciate your support. Stay curious and keep learning. We'll see you next week.